You know what's funny about your mother? She smiles and nods like she understands, but she's just a simple old woman who probably never even finished high school. God, I can't believe I have to spend the holidays with her every year. Those words sliced through the air in perfect Mandarin as I carefully ladled the homemade chicken soup I'd spent hours preparing into my future daughter-in-law's bowl. Vivian didn't notice how my hand trembled slightly, or how my smile froze on my face. She continued chatting with her sister on speakerphone, laughing about my outdated kitchen, my tacky decorations, and how she was stuck, marrying into such a basic American family. My son Michael sat obliviously scrolling through his phone at the other end of the table, completely unaware of what was happening. How could he know? Vivian had carefully cultivated this persona around him. Sweet, accommodating, the perfect partner. But when she thought no one could understand her, the mask slipped completely. I placed the soup tureen down and quietly took my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. 35 years of keeping a part of myself hidden, of letting people assume things about me based on my appearance, my name, my life in small-town Vermont. 35 years since I'd left Beijing with nothing but determination and dreams. 35 years of building a life where I'd deliberately let my accent fade, where I'd become just Mary Johnson, the widow who runs the local bookstore. "Mom, this soup smells amazing," Michael said, finally looking up from his phone. "Vivian, you should ask my mom for the recipe. It's been my favorite since I was a kid." Vivian switched immediately to English. "Oh, I'd love that, Mary. It smells divine. You'll have to teach me all your kitchen secrets before the wedding." The syrupy sweetness in her voice made my stomach turn. I watched her end the call with her sister, switching personas as effortlessly as changing channels on a television. I'd been observing this pattern for months now, catching snippets of her true feelings when she thought I couldn't understand. But tonight was different. Tonight, she'd laid bare exactly what she thought of me, of the life I'd built, of the family she was marrying into. "I'd be happy to teach you," I replied softly, buying myself time to think. The wedding was just 3 months away. My only son, my pride and joy, was about to commit his life to someone wearing the most convincing mask I'd ever seen. In that moment, stirring my spoon through the soup I no longer had an appetite for, I made a decision. This charade couldn't continue, but I wouldn't explode, wouldn't create a scene that would force my son to choose sides. No, this required something more measured, more strategic. This required patience, something I'd cultivated through decades of rebuilding my life from scratch in a foreign land. Vivian laughed at something on her phone, showing it to Michael, who smiled adoringly at her. My chest tightened with a mother's protective instinct. I'd survived famine in my childhood, escaped political persecution as a young woman, and rebuilt my entire existence in a country where I'd initially known no one. I'd faced impossible odds before. As I watched them together, the path forward became clear. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is information, and the wisdom to know exactly when to use it. My name is Mary Johnson, though I was born Li Meihua in a small village outside Beijing. Most people in Burlington, Vermont, know me as the quiet widow who runs Cornerstone Books, the independent bookstore on Maple Street that somehow survived the age of Amazon and e-readers. What they don't know is the story that brought me here, a story I've kept mostly to myself for nearly 4 decades. I came to America in 1987, young and terrified but determined. I'd been a promising literature student at Beijing University until the political climate made it impossible to stay. With help from an American professor who recognized my potential, I secured a student visa and fled with nothing but a small suitcase and my unfinished manuscript translations. In Boston, I met James Johnson, a kind-hearted English professor who saw past my broken English and recognized a kindred spirit. We fell in love over discussions of Dickens and Austen, building a bridge between our worlds through literature. When he was offered a position at a small college in Vermont, I followed, leaving behind the Chinese communities of the city for the quiet isolation of rural New England. "Blend in" became my mantra. I changed my name, softened my accent through countless hours of practice, and embraced my new American identity. When neighbors asked about my slight accent, I'd smile and say, "Oh, I grew up in California," a vague explanation that satisfied most people's curiosity. It wasn't shame that drove this decision. It was survival. The political situation I'd fled meant maintaining a low profile, especially in those early years. James and I had Michael when I was 36, after years of trying. He was our miracle, a perfect blend of his father's thoughtful blue eyes and my stubborn determination. I spoke to him in English exclusively, another piece of my heritage carefully tucked away. James knew my story, of course, but respected my choice to keep it private. When Michael was 14, James died suddenly of a heart attack. I found myself alone in Vermont, a widow with a teenage son and a bookstore mortgage. Those were dark years, stretching pennies until they screamed, working 16-hour days between the store and freelance translation work I did quietly on the side. Michael never knew about the second job. I wanted him to focus on school, on friends, on having a normal American childhood, and he did. My son thrived, earned a scholarship to Boston University, and landed a great job at a tech firm in Burlington after graduation. He moved back home, not to the small apartment above the bookstore where we'd lived since James died, but to a modern condo overlooking Lake Champlain. He became exactly what I'd sacrificed everything for: successful, confident, unencumbered by the weight of history. When he brought Vivian home a year ago, I was genuinely happy for him. She was beautiful, educated, ambitious, everything a mother could want for her son. The daughter of Chinese immigrants herself, though born and raised in California, she worked as a marketing executive at the same company as Michael. On paper, they were perfect. "Mom, I think she's the one," Michael told me after just 3 months of dating. I smiled and hugged him, ignoring the slight unease I felt. Something about Vivian's too perfect smile, the calculated way she complimented my home while her eyes registered disappointment. It triggered warnings I couldn't quite articulate. Still, I welcomed her warmly. I made traditional American meals when they visited, played the role of the simple bookstore owner she clearly believed me to be. If she found it strange that my bookstore had an extensive collection of Chinese literature and translation, she never mentioned it. If she wondered why a woman with no apparent connection to China had such perfect pronunciation of the few Mandarin phrases I learned for her benefit, she didn't say. The first time I heard her true thoughts was 6 months ago, during a phone call with her mother. I was in the kitchen, and she was in the living room, speaking rapidly in Mandarin about her future mother-in-law who ran some little bookstore, and how she'd have to endure my simple home cooking until after the wedding. I froze, dish towel in hand, as decades of carefully constructed identity wavered. Since then, I'd caught more and more glimpses of the real Vivian, calculating, status-obsessed, and deeply disappointed that her future husband came with such an ordinary mother-in-law. Each time, I swallowed my words and maintained my facade, until tonight, when her mockery went too far. Now, as I sit across from her at my dining table, watching her perform the role of loving future daughter-in-law, I wonder what James would advise me to do. My gentle husband had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, in kindness as a first response, but he had also taught English literature. He understood better than anyone how deceiving appearances could be. The dinner continued with the usual small talk. Michael described a project he was working on. Vivian nodded supportively while occasionally checking her watch. I cleared the soup bowls and brought out the main course: pot roast with roasted potatoes and carrots, Michael's favorite since childhood. "Everything looks wonderful, Mary," Vivian said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "So, homey." I recognized the slight hesitation, the barely concealed condescension. In the past, I'd pretended not to notice. Tonight, I simply nodded and served the food. "Mom makes the best pot roast in New England," Michael said proudly. "Wait till you taste it, Viv." As we ate, Michael's phone buzzed. "Sorry, I need to take this. Work emergency." He excused himself and stepped onto the porch, leaving Vivian and me alone. Almost immediately, her phone rang. Seeing the Chinese characters on the screen, she answered in Mandarin without hesitation. I continued eating, maintaining my oblivious expression as her conversation unfolded. "Yes, I'm still at her house," Vivian said, voice dripping with annoyance. "No, we can't leave yet. We haven't even discussed the wedding plans, which is the whole reason we're here." She paused, listening to the person on the other end. I know, but just a few more months and it'll be official. Michael's position at the company is only getting stronger. Did I tell you they're considering him for the Singapore expansion? That would be perfect. We could leave this backwater state and his clingy mother behind. My fork paused midway to my mouth. Singapore? Michael hadn't mentioned any international position. No, he hasn't told her about the possibility yet, Vivian continued, confirming my suspicion. Why would he? She'd just make that sad puppy face she does whenever he mentions traveling. It's pathetic how dependent she is on him. I carefully placed my fork down, struggling to maintain my neutral expression. Dependent on Michael? I'd raised him alone after James died, working myself to exhaustion to provide for him. I'd encouraged him to go away to college, to travel, to live his own life. Never once had I leaned on him financially or emotionally. The occasional Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings were the extent of what I asked for. The wedding is still on for June, Vivian said. Small ceremony, like we discussed. I've convinced Michael that his mother can host a tiny reception at her house for her bookstore friends afterward. That way we don't have to invite them to the real celebration at the waterfront hotel. 2 receptions? This was the first I'd heard of any such arrangement. Michael had told me they wanted a simple ceremony at Lake Champlain, followed by a reception for all their friends and family. Yes, I know it's devious, Vivian laughed, but you should see her house. It's filled with garage sale furniture and smells like old books. I can't have the partners from the firm seeing that. Michael's background is, well, let's just say it needs some editing if he's going to move up. The casual cruelty stole my breath. I'd furnished my home with carefully chosen antiques, many selected with James over our years together. My house smelled like books because literature had been the foundation of my life, my marriage, my business. Don't worry, I've got it all under control, Vivian continued. Michael trusts me completely. He thinks I'm helping plan a beautiful, intimate wedding. He has no idea about the second reception or that I've already put a deposit down on the hotel. His mother will never know either. I'll just tell him that my parents insisted on hosting something separate for their friends. The door opened as Michael returned, and Vivian switched seamlessly to English mid-sentence. And I was thinking maybe daisies for the centerpieces. Something simple and elegant. What do you think, Mary? I looked into her eyes, seeing the calculated innocence there, and felt something shift inside me. For 35 years, I'd kept my history private for my own protection. Now, that same privacy was being weaponized against me and my son. Vivian had no idea who she was truly dealing with. A woman who had survived far worse than a manipulative future daughter-in-law. Daisies would be lovely, I said softly. Simple things often have unexpected depth. She didn't catch my meaning, but smiled triumphantly, believing her deception successful. Michael sat back down, apologizing for the interruption. So, where were we with the wedding plans? I watched as Vivian launched into an elaborate description of the ceremony she envisioned. The ceremony, I now knew, that was merely a decoy for her real plans. As she spoke, I nodded and smiled, playing my assigned role while inwardly rewriting the script. My son deserved to know the truth, not just about Vivian, but about me, about the strength and resilience he'd inherited that went far deeper than he knew. The question wasn't if I would reveal what I knew, but how and when. Later that night, after Michael and Vivian left, I found myself unable to sleep. I went to the attic, to the cedar chest I hadn't opened in years. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper, lay the remnants of a life I'd left behind. A faded photograph of my parents standing before our small home in rural China, my father's stern face belying the gentle hands that taught me to write my first characters, my university ID card, the hopeful young woman in the photo unaware of how her world would soon shatter, and the thin journal I'd kept during my escape. Sitting on the dusty attic floor, I allowed myself to remember. Beijing, 1986. The university campus buzzing with whispered conversations, with hope and fear intertwined. I was 22, the first in my family to attend university, burning with passion for literature and the dangerous idea that words could change the world. My professor, Dr. Wei, had introduced me to Western classics alongside our own literary traditions. Bridges between worlds, he called these books, his eyes alight with the same fervor that animated my own studies. When the political winds shifted and the crackdowns began, Dr. Wei was one of the first targeted. I still remember his final words to me. Meihua, your mind is too valuable to be silenced. My colleague at Harvard can help you. Go and carry our stories with you. 3 days later, he disappeared. I fled in the night, leaving behind my parents with promises I wasn't sure I could keep. The journey was a blur of terror. Border crossings with falsified papers, days spent hiding in cargo holds, the constant fear of discovery. When I finally arrived in Boston, I was hollow-eyed and 15 pounds lighter, clutching my precious manuscript translations and Dr. Wei's letter of introduction. Professor James Johnson was nothing like I expected, younger than Dr. Wei, with kind eyes and an awkward manner that put me immediately at ease. He helped secure my student status, found me a tiny apartment, and gave me my first job cataloging books in his department's library. "Your English is remarkable," he told me after hearing me read aloud from Jane Austen. "But you don't have to erase your accent completely, you know." I shook my head, determined. I must blend in. It's safer. He didn't press, but months later, when we'd grown closer, he asked me about my past over tea in his book-lined office. "Someday, I'll tell my children," I replied. "But for now, it's a weight I need to set down to move forward." James respected my decision, though he gently encouraged me to maintain my connection to my language by helping him translate contemporary Chinese poetry. Those afternoons in his office, moving between languages, I felt the first stirrings of love, not just for him, but for the possibility of a life that honored both worlds. When we married 3 years later, my parents couldn't attend. China's policies made travel impossible for them. Instead, we held a small ceremony in a garden with James's family and my small circle of Chinese student friends. I wore a white dress with red embroidery, a compromise between traditions, like so much of my life. We moved to Vermont when James accepted a teaching position at Middlebury College. The adjustment was jarring, from Boston's vibrant international community to a town where I was often the only Asian face for miles. James suggested I embrace my heritage openly, but fear still guided my decisions. "This is post-Cold War America," he argued gently. "You're safe here." But the habits of survival run deep. I continued my careful self-editing, speaking English exclusively in public, cooking American meals for guests, becoming Mary Johnson so completely that sometimes Li Mei Hua felt like a character in one of my books. The bookstore was James's idea. "You love literature more than anyone I've ever met," he said. "Why not create a space for that love?" Cornerstone Books began as a tiny shop with a carefully curated collection. I specialized in translated works, creating a subtle bridge to my past. The local college students appreciated the international selection, never questioning why this seemingly all-American woman had such expertise in global literature. When I became pregnant at 36, after years of trying and 2 miscarriages, James and I were cautiously overjoyed. The pregnancy was difficult, confined to bed for the final months while James ran the store and brought me books to keep my mind occupied. Michael arrived on a snowy December morning, tiny and perfect. Holding him, I made a silent promise. He would never know fear or hunger or displacement. He would have roots, stability, the sense of belonging I'd sacrificed. As he grew, I sometimes caught glimpses of my mother in his expressions, my father in his stubborn determination. I taught him to read early, filling his childhood with stories, though never my own. James sometimes gave me questioning looks when Michael asked about my family, and I deflected with vague answers, but he never contradicted my choices. One day, I'd whisper to James in the darkness of our bedroom, "When he's older, I'll tell him everything." But time slipped away. Michael grew into a bright, curious boy who assumed his mother was exactly who she appeared to be. And then, when he was 14, James collapsed while shoveling snow from our driveway. A massive heart attack, sudden and irreversible. I stood at the funeral, my son's hand in mine, surrounded by James's colleagues and our friends, feeling utterly adrift. James had been my anchor in America, the one person who knew all of me. With him gone, I retreated further into my carefully constructed identity, focusing entirely on keeping the bookstore afloat and providing for Michael. The years that followed were lean ones. I sold our house and moved us into the apartment above the bookstore to cut expenses. At night, after closing, I took on translation work, converting technical documents from Mandarin to English for a firm in Boston. The irony wasn't lost on me. The language I'd suppressed publicly was now putting food on our table in secret. Michael never complained about our reduced circumstances. He worked part-time stocking shelves after school, applied himself to his studies, and won a partial scholarship to Boston University. The day he left for college, I stood in his empty bedroom and wept. For his future, bright with promise, and for all the truths I still hadn't shared. Now, sitting in my attic surrounded by the artifacts of my former life, I wondered what James would advise. The Singapore revelation from Vivian's phone call echoed in my mind. Michael hadn't mentioned any such possibility. Was he keeping secrets too? Or was Vivian manipulating this situation as skillfully as she'd manipulated everything else? I picked up a small jade pendant, my mother's parting gift. "For courage," she'd said, pressing it into my palm before I left. I'd kept it hidden all these years, this talisman of a life left behind. Tomorrow, I decided, I would visit my safety deposit box at the bank. There were documents there, pieces of my history I'd preserved, even while hiding them from view. Perhaps it was time to reclaim all the parts of myself I'd carefully packed away, not just for my sake, but for Michael's. The following Saturday was Michael and Vivian's engagement party, hosted by Vivian's parents at their vacation home on Lake Champlain. The sprawling lakefront property made my modest home look like a cabin by comparison. Exactly as Vivian had intended, I suspected. I'd spent the morning preparing a special gift, a rare first edition of The Great Gatsby, which Michael had loved since his father first read it to him as a child. I'd been saving it for a significant occasion, and despite my misgivings about Vivian, I wanted to honor my son's choice with something meaningful. I arrived early to help set up, dressed in my best navy dress and carrying the carefully wrapped book. Vivian's mother, Catherine, greeted me with a tight smile. "Mary, thank you for coming early. The caterers are in the kitchen if you'd like to help them arrange the hors d'oeuvres." The dismissal was clear. I wasn't a guest to be entertained, but extra help for the kitchen. I nodded and moved past her, placing my gift on the designated table before seeking out Michael. I found him on the deck with Vivian and several people I didn't recognize. Colleagues from their firm, I assumed. He brightened when he saw me, coming over for a hug. "Mom, you look great. Come meet everyone." I allowed him to lead me to the group, noting Vivian's momentary frown before her social mask slipped back into place. She kissed my cheek, her perfume overwhelming. "Mary, I'm so glad you're here. Have you met our friends from work?" The introductions were a blur of names and polite smiles. I noticed several of them exchange glances when Michael mentioned I owned a bookstore. One woman, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, asked with barely concealed condescension, "A physical bookstore? How quaint. It's amazing those still exist." "Mom's place is actually really successful," Michael defended. "She's got a loyal customer base and hosts events for local authors." "How entrepreneurial," the woman replied, her tone suggesting she meant something entirely different. Vivian smoothly changed the subject, steering the conversation toward their recent business trip to New York. I stood quietly, sipping my wine, observing the dynamic. Michael seemed slightly uncomfortable but eager to impress, while Vivian controlled the narrative with practiced ease. After a few minutes, Vivian's father called Michael over to discuss something, leaving me with Vivian and her friends. Almost immediately, their body language shifted, subtly excluding me from their circle. "So, Mary," one of the men said, "Vivian tells us you're originally from California?" Before I could answer, Vivian's phone chimed. She glanced at it and said something in Mandarin to the Asian woman beside her, who responded in kind. They both laughed, and Vivian gave me an apologetic smile. "Sorry, work emergency. You were saying about California?" I recognized a deflection when I saw one. "Yes, I lived there briefly before moving east." The conversation drifted, and soon they were discussing luxury brands I'd never heard of and vacation properties in countries I'd only read about. I excused myself, claiming I needed to check on my gift, and retreated to the relative quiet of the house. In the elegant living room, I found Catherine directing the staff on final arrangements. She was speaking to a young Asian woman in rapid Mandarin, critiquing everything from the flower arrangements to the place settings. "The mother of the groom is totally unsophisticated," I heard her say as I entered. "Make sure she's seated with the older relatives, not with any of the firm partners. Vivian is concerned she'll say something embarrassing." I froze, hand on the doorframe, as Catherine continued, unaware of my presence. "Yes, apparently she runs some little bookshop. No education to speak of. Vivian says Michael is completely self-made, rose above his circumstances. We'll need to help polish his background a bit before the partnership announcement." The young woman nodded, then noticed me standing in the doorway. Her eyes widened slightly. Catherine turned, her expression shifting from annoyance to forced politeness when she saw me. "Mary, I didn't hear you come in. Can I help you find something?" "I was just looking for the restroom," I managed to say. my voice steadier than I felt. "Down the hall to the left," she replied, clearly relieved I hadn't understood her comments. I nodded and walked away, my face burning with humiliation, not just for myself, but for my son, whose achievements were being reduced to a rags-to-riches narrative that served Vivian's social climbing, for James, whose dedication as a professor and father was erased in their fictional version of our lives, for my own parents, who had sacrificed everything to give me an education they themselves never had. In the pristine bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. I saw what they saw, a simple, aging bookseller, unremarkable, and easily dismissed. But behind that reflection stood Li Meihua, the scholar who had once translated Dickens into Mandarin, who had crossed oceans and rebuilt her life from nothing, who had raised a son to be kind and intelligent without ever burdening him with her pain. I straightened my shoulders and dried my face. As I reached for the door handle, I heard Vivian and one of her friends enter the adjacent bedroom. "God, I can't believe your future mother-in-law showed up in that dress from last season," the friend said in Mandarin. "Does she even realize how out of place she looks?" Vivian laughed. "She has no idea. And Michael's too nice to tell her. I swear, when we move to Singapore, I'm limiting their contact to video calls twice a year." "So, the Singapore position is definite?" "Almost. I've been working on the regional director. He plays golf with my father. Once it's finalized, I'll ease Michael into the idea of moving. His mother will have a fit, of course, but he'll come around. He always does." I stood perfectly still, hand frozen on the doorknob, as Vivian continued. "The sad thing is, she thinks she's getting this big mother-of-the-groom moment at the wedding. She has no idea we're planning the real reception without her. I've told Michael we'll do a small family ceremony for his bookshop friends, but the actual celebration will be at the waterfront. Can you imagine her at a black tie event? She'd probably bring a tote bag instead of a clutch." They both dissolved into laughter. Something snapped inside me, not in anger, but in clarity. All these years I'd hidden my true self out of habit, out of fear, out of the misguided notion that I was protecting my son. But in doing so, I'd allowed people like Vivian and her family to create their own narrative about us, one that diminished everything we were. I quietly exited the bathroom through a second door that led to the hallway, avoiding the bedroom where Vivian and her friend continued their mockery. Moving with purpose, I found my purse and removed the small jade pendant I'd brought with me today, my mother's courage token. Outside, guests were arriving in greater numbers. I spotted Michael near the dock, speaking animatedly with Vivian's father. His face was alight with enthusiasm, reminding me so much of James that my heart ached. My son deserved better than to be someone's social renovation project. He deserved the truth. About his fiancée, yes, but also about his mother. I clasped the pendant tightly, feeling the smooth stone warm in my palm. The time for hiding was over. As twilight descended over Lake Champlain, the engagement party shifted into its formal phase. String lights illuminated the expansive deck, and waitstaff circulated with champagne. Michael found me standing alone near the water's edge. "Mom, are you okay? You've been quiet all evening." His concern was genuine, his eyes, so like his father's, searching my face. I squeezed his hand. "I'm fine, just a little overwhelmed by the crowd. I know it's a lot." Vivian's parents went all out. He glanced back at the house, where Vivian was holding court among a group of admirers. "They have a different way of doing things than we're used to." "Different isn't always better, Michael," I said softly. "Just different." He looked at me curiously. "That sounds like something Dad would say." I smiled, feeling James's absence acutely in that moment. "He was a wise man, your father." "I wish he could be here," Michael said, his voice catching slightly. "He would have figured out how to fit in with all this." He gestured vaguely at the ostentatious display of wealth around us. "No," I said with sudden certainty. "He wouldn't have tried to fit in. James valued authenticity above all else." I took a deep breath. "Michael, there's something I need to tell you." Before I could continue, Vivian's father clinked a glass, calling everyone's attention for toasts. Michael squeezed my shoulder apologetically. "Hold that thought. I need to get up there." I nodded, watching him join Vivian at the center of the crowd. The speeches began, effusive praise from Vivian's father about Michael's potential, about how pleased they were to welcome him into their family. Vivian's mother spoke next, her carefully rehearsed words painting a picture of the perfect couple. Then it was Michael's turn. My son spoke eloquently about meeting Vivian, about their connection and shared ambitions. He thanked her parents for their generosity and support. Then, to my surprise, he turned to where I stood at the edge of the gathering. I also want to thank my mother, who raised me alone after my father passed away when I was 14. She worked incredibly hard to give me every opportunity, running her bookstore by day and taking on extra work at night, though she thought I didn't know about that. My breath caught. He'd known about the translation work? Everything I am, I owe to her strength and sacrifice, Michael continued. She taught me that true success isn't measured by titles or possessions, but by integrity and compassion. I blinked back tears as scattered applause followed his words. Across the crowd, I caught Vivian's tight smile, the slight stiffening of her posture. Her parents exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with this unscripted deviation that didn't fit their narrative. As the formal toast concluded and guests dispersed toward the dinner buffet, I slipped away from the crowd, needing a moment alone to process. I found a quiet spot on a small dock, extending into the lake, the water lapping gently against the pilings below. Sitting there, I removed the jade pendant from my pocket and held it up to the fading light. My mother had been right. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. For decades, I'd lived cautiously, believing I was protecting myself and my son, but that caution had created a vacuum that people like Vivian were all too happy to fill with their own assumptions and manipulations. "Mrs. Johnson, are you all right out here alone?" I turned to find Catherine's assistant, the young Asian woman from earlier, standing hesitantly at the dock's entrance. "Yes, thank you. Just enjoying the quiet." She stepped closer, her expression uncertain. "I wanted to apologize for earlier. When Mrs. Chen was speaking about you, I felt very uncomfortable. The simple acknowledgement of what had happened touched me unexpectedly. "What's your name?" I asked. "Lin," she replied. "Lin Wei." The surname sent a jolt through me. "Wei? Are you related to Professor Wei Jianping by any chance?" Her eyes widened in surprise. "That was my grandfather. He taught literature at Beijing University in the 1980s. Did you know him?" I stared at her, speechless. Professor Wei, my mentor, the man who had saved my life, was this young woman's grandfather. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet here she was. "Mrs. Johnson," Lin prompted, concerned by my reaction. I made a decision in that moment. "My name wasn't always Johnson," I said quietly, switching to Mandarin. "I was born Li Meihua. Your grandfather was my professor. He arranged my escape to America in 1987. Lin's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with recognition. "You're the student he spoke about, the one who translated Dickens and carried his manuscripts out. My grandmother has your letters. The ones you sent before communication became too dangerous." I nodded, emotion closing my throat. I had no idea he survived the purges. He did, though he spent years under house arrest. He died in 2010, but he spoke of his students often, especially you. Her eyes filled with tears. "He would be so proud to see what you've built here." The validation from this unexpected connection washed over me like a cleansing wave. For so long, I'd kept my past locked away, a secret burden. Now, through this remarkable coincidence, it had found me anyway. "What are you doing working for the Chens?" I asked. Lin smiled ruefully. "I'm getting my MBA. Mrs. Chen is a family friend. She offered me a summer internship with her event planning business. I didn't expect..." She trailed off, glancing back toward the house. "The casual cruelty?" I finished for her. She nodded. "They talk about you and your son as if you're characters in a story they're rewriting. It's wrong." "Yes," I agreed, a new resolve hardening within me. "It is wrong." We spoke for a few minutes longer, Lin sharing stories of her grandfather in his later years. As we talked, I felt layers of my carefully constructed persona falling away. Here was someone who knew my truth, not the sanitized American version I'd created, but my authentic history. The relief was profound. When we returned to the party, I moved through the crowd with a different energy. I observed Vivian maneuvering Michael from group to group, presenting him like a prize acquisition. I watched her parents strategically introducing them to influential connections. I noticed how Michael smiled and played along, but kept glancing back at me, as if ensuring I wasn't left alone for too long. My son had a good heart. He deserved to know the truth. Not just about Vivian's manipulations, but about his own heritage, the strength and resilience that ran in his blood. I'd denied him that knowledge out of misguided protection, and in doing so, had made us both vulnerable to people who valued appearances over substance. As I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, I caught Vivian watching me with narrowed eyes, clearly surprised by my conversation with Lynn. I raised my glass slightly in her direction, a subtle acknowledgement that the game was changing. The mask I'd worn for decades was slipping away. In its place, I felt the steady presence of Li Meihua emerging, the scholar, the survivor, the woman who had crossed oceans and rebuilt her life from nothing. I had been playing defense for far too long. It was time to reclaim my narrative, not just for myself, but for my son. Tomorrow, I would visit my safety deposit box and retrieve the documents I'd kept hidden all these years. It was time for Michael to know exactly who his mother was, and exactly what kind of woman he was planning to marry. The Monday after the engagement party, I closed the bookstore early and drove to First National Bank. The safety deposit box key felt heavy in my hand as I followed the bank manager to the vault. I hadn't opened this box in nearly 15 years. Inside were the documents that proved my existence before Mary Johnson, my original Chinese birth certificate, my Beijing University student ID and academic records, the letters of recommendation from Professor Wei that had secured my admission to Harvard as a visiting scholar, naturalization papers showing my legal name change, and photographs, precious few, of my parents and my early years in America. Most significant was a leather portfolio containing translations I'd published under my Chinese name in academic journals before I'd fully embraced my new identity. Among them was a paper on cultural translation challenges in Dickens's work that had won recognition from the Modern Language Association in 1990. I gathered everything into a canvas bag and drove home, stopping at the copy shop to duplicate key documents. By evening, I had organized the evidence of my former life into a chronological narrative, supplemented with notes explaining context. The following day, I received an unexpected visitor at the bookstore. Lin Wei entered just before closing time, looking nervous. "Mrs. Johnson, or should I say Professor Lee," she said in Mandarin as the last customer left. I smiled at the title I'd never claimed. "Mary is fine, Lin. What brings you here?" She glanced around to ensure we were alone. "I thought you should know. Vivian has been asking questions about you since she saw us talking at the party. She cornered me yesterday, demanding to know what we discussed." "What did you tell her?" "Nothing specific. I said we discovered a mutual interest in Chinese literature." Lin hesitated, but she didn't believe me. She mentioned that she's going to suggest Michael check on your mental health. She implied you might be becoming unstable, making up stories about connections to China. A cold anger settled in my chest. She's trying to discredit me before I can reveal what I know. Lin nodded. "There's more. The Singapore position is real. Her father has already secured it. They're announcing it next week, but they've been planning it for months. Michael's name was only added to the consideration list recently. Does Michael know? I don't think so. From what I overheard, they want to present it as a surprise opportunity, something too good to pass up." Lin looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Chen has already contacted real estate agents in Singapore." I thanked Lin for her warning, and after she left, I locked the shop and went upstairs to my apartment. I needed to act quickly, but carefully. If Vivian succeeded in painting me as unstable or desperate to keep Michael close, anything I revealed would be dismissed. That evening, Michael called, his voice tense. "Mom, do you have time for lunch tomorrow? There's something I want to discuss." "Of course," I replied, already guessing what Vivian had set in motion. We agreed to meet at the small cafe next to my bookstore. After hanging up, I finished organizing my documents and added one more item to the collection, the jade pendant, strung on a new silk cord. Then I made another call to my attorney Sharon Williams, who had handled James's estate and been a loyal friend for decades. "I need to update my will," I told her, "and discuss some other legal matters. Can I come by tomorrow morning?" The next day dawned bright and clear. I met with Sharon at 9, explaining everything, my true history, my concerns about Vivian's manipulations, and my need to protect both myself and Michael. Sharon listened without judgment, then reviewed the documents I'd brought. "These are legitimate and verifiable," she confirmed. "Your academic credentials are impressive, Mary. Or should I say Dr. Lee?" I smiled ruefully. I never completed my doctorate. The political situation forced me to leave before my dissertation was finished. Nevertheless, there's nothing here to suggest instability or delusion. Quite the opposite. She made copies for her files and helped me draft a letter authenticating my documents, which she notarized on the spot. If anyone questions your mental competence, this establishes that you've disclosed your history to a legal professional who found you completely sound of mind. She hesitated. Do you think Vivian would really go that far? I hope not, I replied, but I need to be prepared. At noon, I walked to the cafe where Michael was already waiting, looking troubled. He stood to hug me, his embrace a little tighter than usual. Everything okay? I asked as we sat down. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that my heart twisted. Vivian's concerned about you, Mom. She thinks you've been acting different lately. I kept my expression neutral. Different how? She said you were claiming some connection to her parents' assistant at the party? Something about China? He looked embarrassed. She's worried you might be feeling, I don't know, left out or something. So Vivian had indeed begun her campaign to undermine me. I took a deep breath. Michael, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you long ago. I reached into my bag and removed the folder of documents. This isn't about Vivian, or feeling left out. It's about who I really am. Confusion crossed his face. What are you talking about? My name wasn't always Mary Johnson, I said quietly, opening the folder to reveal my original birth certificate. I was born Li Meihua in a small village outside Beijing. For the next hour, as our coffee grew cold and lunch remained unordered, I told my son the truth. I showed him the university ID, the recommendation letters, the published papers. I described my escape from China, meeting his father, and the decision we'd made together to keep my past private, initially for safety, later out of habit. When your father died, I was afraid, I admitted. Afraid of drawing attention to myself as a single mother with a Chinese background in a small Vermont town. Afraid of disrupting your sense of identity. So I continued the silence. Michael stared at the photographs, especially one showing me and James in our early days, standing before the half-renovated storefront that would become Cornerstone Books. All these years, he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. You've been translating books, knowing multiple languages, running an international literature section. It wasn't just a hobby, was it? No, I admitted. It was my life's work, my academic specialty before I left China. Why tell me now? He asked, though I could see understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. I chose my next words carefully, because I heard Vivian speaking Mandarin at our dinner last week, and at the engagement party. His expression froze. What do you mean? I understand Mandarin perfectly, Michael. It's my native language. I held his gaze steadily. I heard what Vivian says about me when she thinks I can't understand. I heard her discussing plans to move you to Singapore without consulting you. I heard her planning a separate wedding reception that I wouldn't be invited to. The color drained from his face. That can't be right. You must have misunderstood. I didn't, I said gently. And Lin Wei, the young woman I was speaking with at the party, confirmed it. She's the granddaughter of my former professor, by remarkable coincidence. She's been working for Vivian's mother, and has overheard their plans. Michael shook his head in disbelief. Singapore? There's been some talk at work about expanding there, but nothing definite, and certainly nothing involving me. According to Lin, the announcement is coming next week. Vivian's father has already arranged it. He sat back, visibly struggling to process everything. This is a lot, Mom. I know, and I'm sorry for keeping my past from you for so long. That was my mistake, one I deeply regret. I reached across the table to take his hand, but I couldn't stay silent when I saw what was happening. You deserve to know the truth. About me, and about the woman you're planning to marry. Michael was silent for a long moment, staring at the documents spread before him, evidence of a mother he'd never fully known. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and confusion. I need some time to think, he said, about all of this. I understand, I replied, packing the documents away. Take all the time you need, but please verify what I've told you about Vivian before dismissing it. Ask her directly about Singapore. Ask about the wedding plans. He nodded slowly, then rose to leave. At the door, he turned back. Mom, the books in Chinese calligraphy on the top shelf in your office. The ones you never let me touch as a kid. My journals, I confirmed, and letters from my parents, until communication became too dangerous. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, of 1,000 small clues he'd observed over the years, but never pieced together. I'll call you, he said, and then he was gone, walking quickly down the street toward his office. I remained at the table, ordering a cup of tea I didn't really want, giving my racing heart time to settle. I had done what I needed to do, revealed both my truth and Vivian's deception. Now I could only wait and hope that my son would see clearly through the fog of manipulation that had surrounded him. That evening, as I was closing the bookstore, Lynn appeared again, looking agitated. "Vivian knows I spoke to you," she said without preamble. "She's furious. She's moved up the Singapore announcement. It's happening tomorrow instead of next week. I thought you should know." I thanked her for the warning, feeling a strange calm descend. The pieces were in motion now. All I could do was stand firm in my truth and trust that Michael would find his way to clarity. ATO8. Preparação para o contra-ataque. 3 days passed without word from Michael. I kept the bookstore running as usual, greeting regular customers with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. Each evening, I returned to my apartment above the shop and watched the street below, half expecting to see my son's familiar figure approaching. On the 4th day, Sharon called. "Mary, I've been doing some research on the Chens," she said without preamble. "There are some interesting financial entanglements you should know about." I listened as she detailed connections between Vivian's father's investment firm and Michael's company, specifically, a significant stake in the Singapore expansion. "It appears the Chens have been positioning pieces on this board for quite some time," Sharon concluded. "If Michael were to decline the Singapore position, it could potentially complicate their investment strategy." "Thank you," I said. "This helps complete the picture." After hanging up, I made 2 decisions. First, I would open the store late tomorrow to visit the university library and access their business databases. I needed to understand exactly what was at stake for the Chens. Second, I would prepare my home for a confrontation I increasingly felt was inevitable. That evening, I carefully arranged my apartment. On the coffee table, I placed family photos I'd kept hidden, pictures of my parents, of James and me in our early days, of Michael as a baby in my arms at the hospital. Beside them, I set out my academic awards and publications. On the bookshelf, I moved my collection of classic Chinese literature from the back room to the main living area, along with the calligraphy set James had gifted me on our 5th anniversary. I brewed a pot of the oolong tea my mother had favored, its familiar scent filling the apartment with memories. I was reclaiming my space, my history, my identity, not out of spite or for tactical advantage, but because it was time to live authentically, without apology. The following morning, after my research at the university confirmed Sharon's findings, I returned to find Lynn waiting outside the bookstore. "Michael confronted Vivian about Singapore yesterday," she said as I unlocked the door. "It didn't go well. She accused you of manipulating him, of making up stories because you're afraid of being abandoned." "I expected as much," I replied calmly. "Did he believe her?" "I don't know, but there's more." Lynn lowered her voice. "Mrs. Chen called my supervisor at business school, claiming I breached confidentiality. She's threatening to have my internship credit revoked." I ushered her inside, locking the door behind us. "I'm so sorry, Lynn. This is my fault." She shook her head firmly. "No, it's not. They're the ones attempting to manipulate everyone around them. I've already spoken to my academic advisor and explained the situation. Fortunately, he's known the Chen family's reputation for years." Her courage impressed me. "Still, you've taken a risk by helping me." Lynn smiled slightly. "My grandfather always said that standing silent in the face of wrongdoing was its own kind of dishonesty." She reached into her bag and withdrew a folder. I brought something that might help. Internal emails about the Singapore arrangement that Vivian asked me to print. She was careless about logging out of her computer. I hesitated. "I can't ask you to compromise your professional ethics." "You didn't ask," Lynn replied. "And I'm not violating confidentiality by exposing potential corporate impropriety. My ethics professor would call this whistleblowing." The documents confirmed what Sharon and my research had suggested. The Singapore position had been created specifically as a way to smooth regulatory approval for the Chen family's investment in the Asian market. Michael's technical expertise would be valuable, but his primary function would be as an American face for a complex financial arrangement. I made copies and returned the originals to Lynn. "These might become important," I said, "but I hope they won't be necessary." After Lynn left, I opened the store and tried to focus on my customers. Around noon, my phone rang. Michael, asking if he could come by that evening. His voice was tight, controlled in a way that reminded me of how I'd sounded during my early years in America, carefully measuring every word. "Of course," I said. "I'll make dinner." "Don't go to any trouble," he replied. "Vivian will be coming with me." After hanging up, I took a deep breath and considered this development. So, they would present a united front. I had expected Vivian to avoid me, to have Michael meet me alone while she crafted her counter-narrative from a distance. Her decision to confront me directly suggested either confidence or desperation. I spent the afternoon preparing, not just the meal, a simple American pot roast, Michael's childhood favorite, but myself. I reviewed the documents Sharon had prepared, including the notarized statement confirming my mental competence. I placed Lynn's folder in my desk drawer, accessible, but not immediately visible. I changed into a simple blue dress that James had always loved, and fastened my mother's jade pendant around my neck. At 7 precisely, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Michael and Vivian standing side by side, her arm looped possessively through his. His expression was guarded, hers triumphant behind a thin veneer of concern. "Mary," she said warmly, embracing me with practiced affection. "We've been so worried about you." I stepped back, allowing them to enter. "There's no need for concern. I'm perfectly well." Michael's eyes darted around the apartment, taking in the changes, the Chinese literature prominently displayed, the calligraphy set on the desk, the photographs he'd never seen before. Vivian noticed too, her smile faltering slightly. "You've redecorated," she observed, her tone carefully neutral. "Not redecorated," I corrected gently. "Simply stopped hiding." I gestured to the living room. "Please, sit down. Dinner is almost ready." As they moved to the couch, I saw Vivian's gaze land on the academic papers bearing my Chinese name. Her body tensed, almost imperceptibly, and she whispered something to Michael, who frowned but shook his head. I brought out a tray with the tea service. My mother's porcelain cups, which I'd kept wrapped in silk at the back of my cupboard for decades. "Longjing," Vivian identified immediately as I poured, unable to hide her surprise. "Very high quality." "Yes," I agreed, switching to perfect unaccented Mandarin. My parents sent it from Hangzhou before they passed. They always preferred the spring harvest. The color drained from Vivian's face. Beside her, Michael watched the exchange with newfound clarity in his eyes. "Mom has been explaining some things to me," he said quietly. "About her past. About her understanding of our conversations, Vivian." Vivian recovered quickly, placing her hand on Michael's arm. "Michael, you can't possibly believe these sudden stories. Your mother has never mentioned any connection to China before. Don't you think that's strange?" "What I find strange," I interjected before Michael could respond, "is planning a separate wedding reception without including the groom's mother, or arranging an international job transfer without consulting the employee in question." "That's ridiculous," Vivian snapped, dropping all pretense of warmth. "Michael, she's obviously fabricating these claims because she's afraid of losing you." I remained calm, sipping my tea. "Fan yi Michael, he wo de dui hua," I said to her. "Translate Michael's and my conversation." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't speak Chinese," she insisted in English. "I was born in California, yet you speak it fluently with your parents," I noted, "and with your sister on the phone during our dinner last week, when you described me as a simple old woman who probably never finished high school." Michael stiffened beside her. "Is that true?" "Of course not." Vivian looked outraged. "She's making this up, Michael. Can't you see what's happening? She's threatened by our relationship, by your success, by the possibility of you moving forward with your life." I set down my cup with deliberate precision. "I have recordings," I said quietly. This was a calculated risk. I had no recordings, but Vivian couldn't know that. "What?" she whispered, her composure cracking. "The bookstore has a security system with audio," I continued. "It was running during our dinner, and I wear a recording device at all public events, including the engagement party, a precaution I began taking after James died, for my personal safety as a woman often closing the store alone at night. The lie was strategic, designed to make Vivian question everything she'd said within potential earshot. From her rapidly paling face, I could see it was working. "That's illegal," she stammered. "You can't record people without their consent. Vermont is a one-party consent state," I replied, thanking Sharon silently for this legal insight. "As long as one person in the conversation knows it's being recorded, it's perfectly legal." Michael looked between us, confusion giving way to understanding. "What exactly did you say about my mother, Vivian?" Vivian's expression hardened. "This is absurd. She's manipulating you, Michael. There are no recordings. She doesn't speak Chinese. She's a bookstore owner from Vermont who's afraid of losing her son and inventing elaborate fictions to prevent it. I rose and walked to my desk, removing a file folder. Not Lynn's documents, but my own academic records. Harvard University, Visiting Scholar Program 1987-1989. I read, sliding the acceptance letter toward them. Under my birth name, Li Mei Hua, followed by naturalization papers and legal name change to Mary Johnson in 1990, shortly before our marriage. Michael took the documents, examining them carefully. Vivian's eyes darted between us, her strategy visibly crumbling. Even if this is true, she said finally, it doesn't change the fact that your mother is trying to interfere in our relationship, Michael. She's clearly been hiding things from you your entire life. Why trust her now? Because, Michael said slowly, she's never tried to control my decisions or manipulate my career for her own benefit. He turned to face Vivian directly. Unlike the Singapore position your father arranged without telling me. Vivian's expression froze. Who told you that? It doesn't matter who told me. What matters is that it's true, isn't it? The position was created specifically for me, as part of your family's investment strategy. I watched as Vivian calculated her options, finally settling on a new approach. It's a fantastic opportunity, Michael, for both of us. My father was trying to help you, help us. By going behind my back, by planning our future without my input. Michael's voice was steady, but I could hear the hurt beneath his words. I was going to surprise you with it, Vivian insisted. It was going to be a wedding gift. Like the second reception at the waterfront, he asked quietly. The one my mother and her friends weren't invited to? Vivian shot me a venomous look before turning back to Michael with tears welling in her eyes. I just wanted everything to be perfect. Your mother doesn't understand our world, Michael. She would have been uncomfortable with my parents' friends. No, I said gently. You were uncomfortable with me, with what I represented, with the parts of Michael's background that didn't fit your narrative. The timer in the kitchen chimed, signaling that dinner was ready. I rose to check it, leaving them alone momentarily. Through the pass-through, I could see Vivian leaning close to Michael, speaking intensely. He sat still, listening but not responding. When I returned, Vivian stood abruptly. I think I should go, she announced. You clearly need time with your mother, Michael. We can discuss this when you're thinking more clearly. The dismissive tone, the implication that Michael's judgment was compromised. These were the tactics of someone accustomed to controlling others through subtle manipulation. I remained silent, allowing Michael to respond. He rose slowly. I think that's a good idea, Vivian. I'll call you tomorrow. Her confidence faltered at his tone. Michael, tomorrow, he repeated firmly. After Vivian left, Michael and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, he looked up at me, his expression a complex mixture of hurt, confusion, and dawning understanding. Why didn't you ever tell me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, about who you really are. At first it was for safety, I admitted. Later it became habit. And after your father died, I was afraid that changing any part of our life together would feel like losing him all over again. I reached across the table and took his hand. I was wrong to keep it from you. I see that now. He nodded slowly, absorbing this. And Vivian, how long have you known about how she really feels? I began noticing inconsistencies months ago, but I wasn't certain until our dinner last week, when I heard her speaking to her sister. Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that it made my heart ache. I feel like such a fool. You're not a fool, I said firmly. You saw the best in someone. You trusted. Those are qualities to be proud of. She never loved me, did she? He asked quietly. Just what I represented, a stepping stone for her family's ambitions. I considered my answer carefully. I think she loves the idea of you. The successful American tech executive, the perfect husband for her carefully crafted life. Whether she ever saw beyond that to the real you, the kind boy who helped elderly customers carry books to their cars, who read poetry under the oak tree behind the store, who visited your father's grave every month even through college. I don't know. He was quiet for a long moment, then looked up at me with renewed clarity. I want to hear it all, Mom. Everything you've kept hidden. No more secrets between us. I nodded, relief flooding through me. Over dinner? I made your favorite. For the first time that evening, he smiled. A small, sad smile, but genuine nonetheless. Pot roast sounds perfect. We moved to the kitchen, where I served the meal that had nourished him through childhood, through adolescent growth spurts, through the grief of losing his father. As we ate, I began telling him the full story of Li Meihua, the young woman who had crossed oceans and built a new life, who had loved fiercely and protected cautiously, who had finally found the courage to reclaim all the parts of herself she'd carefully packed away. 2 weeks after our revelation-filled dinner, I stood behind the counter at Cornerstone Books, helping a customer find a rare translation of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up to see Vivian entering, her expression determined. I hadn't seen her since that night, though Michael had kept me informed of developments. He'd postponed the wedding indefinitely, citing differences in vision for our future. He'd also declined the Singapore position, instead accepting a promotion within his company's Vermont office. Vivian had alternated between tearful reconciliation attempts and cold accusations, finally returning to her parents' home in Boston the previous weekend. "Mrs. Johnson," she said formally, approaching the counter after my customer departed. "I think we need to talk." "I agree," I replied, gesturing to the reading area at the back of the store. "Would you like some tea?" She shook her head impatiently. "This won't take long." I followed her to the comfortable chairs arranged around a low table stacked with new releases. She remained standing, smoothing her immaculate blazer. "I don't know what game you're playing," she began without preamble, "but you've succeeded in turning Michael against me with your creative storytelling." I sat down, folding my hands in my lap. "I haven't told Michael anything that isn't true, Vivian. You expect me to believe you've been hiding a secret Chinese identity for decades? That you just happen to understand every private conversation I've had?" Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "Yes," I said simply. "That's exactly what happened." She laughed, a brittle sound without humor. "Well, Michael seems to have fallen for it. My father is furious about the Singapore situation. Do you have any idea what you've done to our plans?" The slip was telling. Our plans, not our future, or our relationship. "I think that's the heart of the problem," I observed quietly. "They were your plans for Michael, not plans you made together." Vivian's carefully maintained composure began to crack. "You have no idea what Michael needs. He was going to be somebody important. My father had arranged introductions to the top financial players in Southeast Asia. This wasn't just some job transfer. It was the next level of his career. A career path he never chose," I pointed out. "Did you ever ask him what he wanted?" "He wanted me," she snapped. "And everything that came with that. The connections, the opportunities, the lifestyle. He was thrilled every time my parents included him in their world." I studied her face, seeing beyond the anger to something more vulnerable. "You genuinely believe that, don't you? That the trappings of success were what mattered most to him? Of course they matter. Why else would he have worked so hard to escape this?" She gestured dismissively at the bookstore around us. "This small-town life. He wasn't meant to stay in Vermont forever, running errands for his mother and settling for mediocrity." The bell above the door chimed again. We both turned to see Michael entering, surprise registering on his face when he spotted Vivian. "I thought you'd gone back to Boston," he said, approaching us slowly. "I came to try one more time to make you see reason," Vivian replied, her tone softening immediately, vulnerability replacing the hardness of moments before. "Michael, we can work through this. Whatever concerns you have, whatever stories your mother has told you, we can start fresh." Michael glanced at me, then back to Vivian. "This isn't about my mother's stories, Vivian. It's about honesty, about building a life on truth, not convenience or advantage." "What does that even mean?" she demanded, frustration breaking through. "Everyone crafts narratives, Michael. Everyone presents the version of themselves that works best in a given situation. Your mother did it for decades, hiding her past. How is that any different from what you're accusing me of?" "The difference," I said quietly, "is intent. I hid my past out of fear, then habit, a decision I've come to regret deeply. You created a false persona specifically to manipulate Michael and his perceptions." "That's not true," Vivian protested. "I love Michael. I want what's best for him. What you think is best," Michael corrected gently, without ever asking me what I want. "Fine," she said, crossing her arms. "What do you want, Michael? To stay in this provincial town forever? To pass up career opportunities that people would kill for? To throw away everything we've built together because your mother suddenly decided to reinvent herself as some Chinese scholar?" Michael didn't rise to the bait. Instead, He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, the engagement ring. What I want is a partner who respects me enough to be honest, who sees me as more than a component in their life plan. Vivian stared at the ring, her expression faltering. You're giving this back? Just like that? After everything? I'm acknowledging that we want different things, he said quietly, that we've been moving in different directions all along, but I was too caught up to notice. For a moment, genuine pain flashed across Vivian's face, quickly replaced by cold anger. This is your doing, she said to me, her voice trembling slightly. You couldn't stand seeing him happy, seeing him move beyond your little world. I want nothing more than Michael's happiness, I replied evenly. I always have. Right, Vivian scoffed. That's why you kept him in the dark about his own heritage. That's why you played the simple American widow for decades. Because you're so committed to truth and transparency. Michael stepped forward, placing himself slightly between us. That's enough, Vivian. My mother's choices were her own, made in a context you can't possibly understand, and my decision about our relationship is also my own. Vivian looked between us, calculation replacing anger in her expression. You know this changes everything. My father won't continue supporting the Vermont expansion if we're not together. Your promotion will likely disappear. I'm prepared for that possibility, Michael replied calmly. I've already spoken with the CEO directly. He values my technical expertise, regardless of my personal relationships. Vivian's confident facade crumbled further. This is a mistake, Michael. You're throwing away everything we could have been. No, he said gently. I'm choosing what matters most to me. Integrity, honesty, building a life with someone who wants me for who I am, not what I represent or what doors I can open. She stared at him for a long moment, then turned to me. Congratulations, Mrs. Johnson, or should I say, Professor Lee. You've won this round. She switched to Mandarin, her tone venomous. But remember, you're still just a bookstore owner in a forgotten town. You've ruined your son's chance at real success. I responded in the same language, my voice steady. Success isn't measured by titles or locations, but by integrity and authentic connection. Something my son understands far better than you ever did. Vivian flinched, still unnerved by hearing perfect Mandarin from the woman she'd dismissed for so long. Without another word, she turned and walked out, the bell jangling discordantly as the door slammed behind her. Michael and I stood in silence for a moment. Then he sank into one of the reading chairs, the tension visibly draining from his shoulders. That was harder than I expected, he admitted. I sat beside him, reaching for his hand. Endings usually are. It wasn't real though, was it? He asked quietly. What we had, it was all performance. I think there was something real, I said carefully. Perhaps not what you thought, not what you deserved, but something. People are rarely entirely false. He nodded slowly, absorbing this. The way she looked at you, like she'd discovered you were an imposter. Ironic, considering. We were both wearing masks, I acknowledged. The difference is, I've taken mine off now. Michael squeezed my hand, then looked around the bookstore. At the international literature section I'd carefully curated over decades. At the Chinese calligraphy scrolls I'd recently hung on the walls. At the photograph of James and me now displayed proudly on the counter. I feel like I'm seeing everything differently, he said. Not just Vivian, but you. This place. My whole history. I'm sorry I kept it from you for so long, I said softly. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really just protecting myself, holding on to habits that no longer served any purpose. I understand why you did it, he assured me. After talking with Lynn about her grandfather, about what happened in China during that period, I get it, Mom. I just wish I'd known sooner, known all of you sooner. The bell chimed again as a group of college students entered, heading for the poetry section. I stood, duty calling. We have time, I told Michael, to rediscover each other, to integrate all the pieces of our history. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. I'd like that. As I moved to help my customers, I felt lighter than I had in decades. The confrontation with Vivian had been inevitable, perhaps even necessary. But the true victory wasn't in exposing her manipulations or preventing a marriage built on falsehood. It was in finally embracing my complete self, scholar and bookseller, immigrant and American, Lee Mei Hua and Mary Johnson, and sharing that self with my son. The masks we wear, I reflected as I recommended poetry collections to the eager students. sometimes protect us, but eventually, they can become prisons of our own making. The path to true freedom lies in having the courage to reveal our authentic selves, even when that truth disrupts the carefully constructed narratives we've built around our lives. 1 year later, I stood in the transformed back room of Cornerstone Books, surveying the space with quiet satisfaction. What had once been storage was now the Li Mei Hua Reading Room, a cozy sanctuary dedicated to translated literature and cultural exchange. Comfortable chairs surrounded a large table where my weekly Mandarin conversation group gathered. Bookshelves lined the walls, featuring works from across Asia, alongside translations I'd contributed to over the years. The grand opening was scheduled for tomorrow, coinciding with the Burlington Literary Festival. Michael had arranged for several notable translators to attend, including a former colleague from Harvard who'd been astonished to rediscover me after all these years. "It looks perfect, Mom," Michael said, entering with a box of promotional bookmarks. Professor Wei would be proud. I smiled at the mention of my mentor. After reconnecting with Lin, I'd begun corresponding with Professor Wei's widow in Beijing, slowly rebuilding a connection to my past that had been severed for decades. She'd sent photographs, letters, even some of my early academic work that I'd thought lost forever. "I think James would be proud too," I said, straightening a framed photograph of my late husband that held a place of honor near the entrance. He always wanted me to share my complete self with the world. The past year had brought profound changes. After ending his engagement, Michael had thrown himself into his work, earning that promotion on merit rather than family connections. More significantly, he'd begun exploring his Chinese heritage, taking Mandarin lessons and visiting China for the first time with me as his guide. Our trip to Beijing had been healing in ways I never anticipated. Standing with my son before the university where my academic journey began, introducing him to distant relatives who welcomed him with open arms, watching his eyes widen as he connected pieces of himself previously unknown. These moments had bridged the gap I'd allowed to form through years of protective silence. The visit wasn't without pain. Many places I remembered were gone, transformed by China's rapid development. My childhood village had been absorbed into urban sprawl, my parents' graves relocated to make way for an apartment complex. Yet in this loss, I found unexpected peace, a reminder that change, however difficult, makes room for new growth. Upon our return to Vermont, I decided to expand the bookstore's mission, creating this dedicated space for cultural exchange. The community's response had been overwhelmingly positive, with local schools requesting visits, and the college offering me a position as a guest lecturer in their Asian Studies department. At 61, I was stepping into a role I'd abandoned decades ago, finding my academic voice again in a way that honored both Li Mei Hua's scholarly ambitions and Mary Johnson's practical wisdom. The bell above the main entrance chimed, pulling me from my reflections. Lin entered, carrying a carefully wrapped package. "Perfect timing," she called out, joining us in the reading room. The calligraphy scrolls just arrived from my grandmother. She insisted on having them specially made for tomorrow's opening. We unwrapped the package together, revealing beautifully executed scrolls bearing classical Chinese poems about renewal and homecoming. Since our unexpected meeting at Vivian's engagement party, Lin had become like family. She'd completed her MBA and accepted a position with a cultural exchange foundation in Burlington, turning down more lucrative offers in favor of work that aligned with her values. "These are exquisite," I said, deeply touched by the gesture. "Please thank your grandmother for me." "You can thank her yourself," Lin replied with a smile. "She's finally agreed to visit this summer. She wants to see the reading room named after her husband's favorite student." As Michael and Lin began hanging the scrolls, I stepped back to observe them. Their easy friendship had been an unexpected gift from the painful unraveling of his engagement. Not romantic. Lin was engaged to a professor she'd met at business school, but a genuine connection based on shared values and mutual respect. The front door chimed again, and I returned to the main store to find Sharon browsing the new releases. "Everything ready for tomorrow?" she asked, embracing me warmly. "As ready as it can be," I replied. "Thank you again for handling all the legal aspects of the expansion." Sharon waved away my gratitude. "That's what friends do. Besides, this new direction for the store is exactly what Burlington needs." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Did you hear about Vivian Chen?" I shook my head, unwilling to admit I occasionally searched for news about her. After returning to Boston, Vivian had maintained a dignified public silence about the broken engagement, though Michael had heard through work connections that her family was disappointed by the collapsed alliance. "She's engaged again," Sharon informed me, "to the son of a hotel magnate from Singapore. The announcement was in last Sunday's Boston Globe." I absorbed this without surprise. Vivian had always been strategic, always planning her next move. I hoped, somewhat generously, that she'd found someone who truly complemented her ambitions, someone for whom the performance wouldn't feel like deception. "I wish her well," I said sincerely. "Some people need time and experience to recognize the difference between achievement and fulfillment." Sharon nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of fulfillment, how are you feeling about tomorrow's speech? The mayor specifically requested you open the festival." "Nervous," I admitted, "but ready. It's time to fully inhabit my story." Later that evening, after closing the store and finalizing preparations for the opening, Michael and I walked to our favorite restaurant by the lake. The spring air was cool but pleasant, Burlington coming alive after the long winter. Over dinner, Michael shared news of his recent promotion to technical director and his plans to expand his team. He spoke with passion about his work, with none of the status-seeking Vivian had encouraged. Success for my son wasn't about titles or relocating to financial centers, but about creating something meaningful, something that reflected his values. "I have news too," he said, after we'd ordered dessert. "I've been seeing someone, a librarian at the university. Her name is Rachel." "That's wonderful," I replied, genuinely pleased. "When do I get to meet her?" "She's coming to the opening tomorrow," he said, looking both nervous and excited. "She's actually half Japanese. Her mother immigrated in the 1970s. We met at one of the cultural exchange events at the college." I smiled, hearing what he wasn't explicitly saying. He'd found someone who understood the complexities of dual heritage, who valued the authentic self he was now embracing. "I look forward to meeting her," I said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. Walking home under the starlit sky, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. 36 years since I'd fled China with nothing but determination and hidden manuscripts. 35 years of careful self-editing, of becoming Mary Johnson so completely that sometimes Li Mei Hua felt like a character in one of my books. 1 year since truth had finally broken through the carefully constructed facade, setting us all free in unexpected ways. The next morning, standing before the gathered crowd at the Burlington Literary Festival, I looked out at the faces of friends, customers, colleagues, and strangers. In the front row sat Michael, beside a lovely young woman I assumed was Rachel. Lynn and her fiancé, Sharon and her husband, my conversation group members, all were present to witness this moment. "My name is Li Mei Hua Johnson," I began, my voice clear and unwavering. "I was born in a small village outside Beijing, where my father taught me to write my first Chinese characters by tracing them in the dirt because we couldn't afford paper." As I continued my speech, sharing the journey from young scholar to political refugee to bookstore owner, I felt the power of reclaimed identity flowing through me. The story wasn't always comfortable. Parts were painful, parts revealed mistakes and regrets, but it was authentic. It was mine. "We all wear masks at times," I told the attentive audience. "Sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of habit. The challenge is remembering who we are beneath those masks, and having the courage to reveal our true selves to those we love." After the speech, as people filed into the bookstore to see the new reading room, Michael embraced me tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," he whispered. In that moment, holding my son close in the store James and I had built together, I felt the separate threads of my life finally weaving into a single beautiful tapestry. The scholar and the widow, the immigrant and the business owner, the mother and the mentor, all were essential parts of who I had always been. The masks we wear to protect ourselves can eventually become burdens that isolate us from those we love most. True protection lies not in hiding our authentic selves, but in sharing them with those worthy of our trust. In the end, it wasn't Vivian's mockery at that fateful dinner that had changed everything. It was my decision to finally let myself be fully seen, to reclaim all the pieces of my identity I had carefully packed away. My mother's jade pendant hung around my neck, no longer hidden, but displayed proudly as a symbol of where I'd come from and how far I'd traveled. I touched it lightly as I welcomed guests into the reading room, introducing myself with my full name for perhaps the 100th time that day, each repetition feeling more natural than the last. Lee Mei Hua Johnson. Scholar, immigrant, widow, mother, bookseller. Finally whole, finally free.